wonder, do we have any 6th, 7th, and 8th graders in here? Yeah, we got a few kids. Good. We're going to talk about Genesis today. Does that sound fun for you? You're so lucky to be up here with us adults. You've been in church or you haven't been in church. You've read the Bible. You haven't read the Bible. Do the words "in the beginning" sound familiar to you? A lot of blank stares and very little head nods. Okay, I think you can nod. It's okay to move and participate. In the beginning, wherever you're coming from, there's other stories that start with "in the beginning," but the scriptures start with "in the beginning." So I thought we would just read that together. Is that all right? Okay, you ready? Set, go. Bereshit bara Elohim. One more time. Ready, set, 1, 2, 3, go. Bereshit bara Elohim. Anybody? Did you try changing it? One more time. Bereshit bara Elohim. When's the last time you were reading the Bible? You don't have to raise your hand. And you thought that, oh, this is in a different language than mine. Like the original authors did not speak English. They were living in a very different time frame. They had different meaning to what they were talking about. They had different context and understanding of what they were up to. And my first little thought here, the Bible is an ancient text, but oftentimes we don't treat it like it is, especially when it comes to Genesis 1. And I'll say much more about that along the way. But have you ever been in a conversation? My cousin was in town not long ago, and we were talking about church and pastoring and all this stuff. And he's like, yeah, man, but what do you say? What do you do about dinosaurs? And I'm in that weird moment of I don't really have an answer to that. I feel like I need to reason. I remember being on a bus with a soccer team at one point. All the coaches were up front, and one of the guys that was probably one of my favorite people and the most funny was just making fun of Christianity and doing these things. And he goes off on the dinosaurs, and I'm sitting there yeah, I don't know, man. I can't prove dinosaurs did or didn't exist or what time. I wasn't there, so I don't have much to say. And or you start to get into conversations of okay, hold on. If God created it all, but there was stuff living, but the sun wasn't even there yet. So how do you? And you start doing these rational debates about Genesis. Is this just my life? That's a part of being a pastor. A couple of you. Okay, this is why you don't tell people you're a pastor on an airplane. Gets weird. So with that, Genesis 1 continues. And we're not going to read the whole thing today, but at least this next piece. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Can you remember the first time in your life in which the earth made sense to you? Where I was on my computer prepping for this, and Josie, my daughter, walks up and says, oh, earth, because she saw this image right here. That one's too flat. Next one. She saw that one, was oh, that's earth. Sorry, any flat earthers in here. Jesus loves you. But you and I, at some point at a young age, became familiar that we're on this massive rock that's just flying through the sky, and somehow that's normal. You know who that wasn't normal to? Is people that lived 2,500 years ago. So when they heard that God created the earth, when someone wrote, God created the earth, it is so different than the way that you and I understand earth today. Have you had these thoughts when you consider the scriptures? When you read them, when you hear them, when Jesus actually talks about them? It is so far from your and I's awareness and our normal day life. And so what I want to do over these next 3 weeks is just this short series called East to West. And leaning on a few different resources. Becca, I think your group's been going through this podcast called Bema. And it's how do we actually go through the scriptures from a Jewish or a Messianic Jewish, so the Jews who look at Jesus as their Lord and Savior, from an actual historical perspective. Because we also weren't the origination of the center of the world. I don't know if you guys know that. The American West is more of an experiment than it is survived thousands of years. And so as we sit here now, there's actually people who are in the East who would be closer to the times in which Jesus was alive and then closer to the times of the Israelites and the people that go back thousands of years. And they have some perspectives that would be different than yours and mine. Some of you may not like me after today, and that's okay. I want to invite us to the idea that we are not at the center, and that we actually don't have the full story oftentimes. I know we think we do. I know I think I do often. But what if we could actually have a different perspective that gives Genesis even more meaning than we've ever imagined it to? That while we can't make sense of dinosaurs with it, that while it may not actually be a lab report at the end of the day, though I know our brains want to rationalize that, what if it's way more than that? What if it's so much more than you and I could ever imagine? It's so much more to actually help us understand our meaning and our purpose and our identity that extends way beyond the ways in which we normally superficially and fleetingly try to find those things. What if Genesis 1 in the beginning actually makes a difference for you and I today? Because I don't know about you, oftentimes it feels old and out of reach, and I don't fully understand what's going on. The second thought in all of this is that any act of communication, including God's communication in Scripture, can only convey meaning with a particular language in a historical, cultural context. Meaning, again, they had a different language, they had a different understanding, they saw the world in a different way. And if we're not careful, we can superimpose our understandings and miss what was actually intended. And so the invitation is to consider the original language, to consider the original context, to consider the original worldview. One of the very interesting things is that there were other cosmologies at that time, cosmology being the thing in which we make order out of chaos. So the creation account, Genesis, God making things as a cosmology for Christians. But the Egyptians at the time had a cosmology. The Babylonians at the time had a cosmology. And they were actually written before Genesis was written. And so one of the things that was happening when Genesis was being written, it was actually an understanding that there were other cosmologies. So one would have been Marduk. So this is the Babylonian side. Is this the Egyptian? This is Babylonians. And the god of Marduk, what their understanding was of how the world was created in the skies and the earth and the land and the seas and all these things, is this god fought off this beast, and in conquering it, half of its body painted the sky and the other half painted the ground. It is how they made sense of the earth being created. There's more to it of how the sun is there and how the moon is there and what are the waters and those kind of things. Or we could go to the other side, and there was the sun god of Re. And over here in this boat, throughout the day, the sun would pass over all these other figures and icons and cultural markings and understandings. And as it came over, it would drop down and go into night. And at the night, it would have to fight off the snake, essentially. And it would come up the next day, and it would bring light again. That's how they made sense. That was another cosmology of what is the sun and what is the moon? And there's this order to what seems to be this massive chaos. And so when the book of Genesis was written, there were other cosmologies already out there. You guys bored yet? It's going to get better. So then we start to understand Genesis in a way. Again, we're not going to read it, but we can actually see these parts of it. This is the creation account in bullet points, essentially. We see a God who creates, I'll get to more of this, but we think about as creating light and darkness, creating water and sky, land and sea, sun, moon and stars, fish and birds, animals and humans, and then he does this weird thing. He puts his feet up and just sits back. But he creates all of this. Oftentimes, when you think of any of the scholars, the Jewish theologians, Abraham Heschel, they would actually look at this and say the language used, the waters, the actual beginning where there was just nothingness, chaotic nothingness, and God's Spirit was hovering over the waters. They were using, Moses, as what many would ascribe this to, was using language and imagery that was already out there from the other cultures, to try and bring understanding to the Israelites, the people of God at this time, and other ways in which they would have thought the world worked and would have believed about God or gods. And so they're saying, hey, here's what most people understand, but here's who our God is. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. What's interesting when we think about this as the creation account is what actually happens here is you see 3 and 3. What happens in the beginning, the creation actually looks more like separating things, and then God fills them with things. So he separates the land and the waters. He doesn't create them, he separates them. It's very different than how we normally think of it. The water and the sky, the land and the seas, and then the sun, the moon, the stars come along. The fish and the birds come along. The animals and the humans come along. Now, when this is written, what would happen in someone's brain listening to this is they would quickly pick out this separation of 3s. He separates on 3 different days, and he fills on 3 separate days. And then in a culture that has a high numerology, meaning that numbers make a lot of meaning for them, different for us here in the American West, you would start to wonder what's going on with the 3s here. And if we actually look at the Genesis 1:1 to 2:3, there's 3 days that mirrored 3 days. 3 days of separation, 3 days of filling. The word create appears in the beginning, the middle, and the end. And there's 3 mentions of the create at the closing of the poem. And so your brain would just start kind of going into this thing of 3s. And then throughout the poem, we actually see some other things happen with the words of 7, or the number of 7. And then, so you start to see 7s. The first verse in Hebrew has 7 words. The second verse in the Hebrew has 14 words, 7 times 2. Earth occurs 21 times, 7 times 3. 35 words in the 7th verse, 7 times 5. God, or Elohim, is mentioned 35 times, 7 times 5. It was so is mentioned 7 times. God saw is mentioned 7 times. One Messianic Jew says, if I hear 3 and I hear 7, I wonder if that adds up to 10. Are there any 10s? To make occurs 10 times, according to its kind 10 times. And God said 10 times, 3 in reference to people, 7 in reference to creatures. Let there be occurs 10 times, 3 times in reference to the things in the heavens, 3 times in reference to things on earth. The last statement here on 10s, and there's one more. Yep. Overall, God speaks 10 times in Genesis 1, 2, and 3. There's 3 times that they're divine initiatives towards humanity. Let us make Adam, be fruitful and multiply. Behold, I have given to you. And 7 times are divine creative commands to the creation itself. Let there be. This quote here helps summarize a little bit what's going on here. To suppose that all these appearances of the number 7 are mere coincidence is not possible. This numerical symmetry is, as it were, the golden thread that binds together all the parts of the section. Did Genesis not just come to life in a different way than maybe the way in which you understood it? I could never attempt to write anything this creative. I don't even know where to start. The amount of work that was put in to explain who God is and how he went about things is quite insane to me. And this isn't even all of it. This is some of the numerology. This is some of the patterns that are being picked up. This is some of the work in which they did to intentionally draw out who God is and what it looks like for him to create. There are some refrains in this. What you hear over and over again is, it is good. He creates, and then it is good. He creates, and then it is good. He creates humanity, and it is very good. It's like a good R&B or a rap song. Like you just have this refrain that keeps bringing you back. It is good. It is good. It is good. There's another refrain. It says, and there was evening and there was morning. And then it would say, then the 3rd day, then the 4th day, then the 5th day. And it was evening and it was morning. After every time that he created, it was evening and it was, why would evening and morning play significance and why would it be repeated? For you and I, it doesn't make sense because our day starts when we wake up and the sun's up, doesn't it? But for anyone who is Jewish and for these Israelites, the day actually started at night. And we'll say more about this in a second, but I'll point it out here. To be created by God, your natural disposition and your most natural state is to be at rest. And so the day starts with rest. One more time. The day starts with rest. But we say things like, well, I can't wait for the weekend. Oh, I can't wait to get to sleep tonight. Rest is the thing that we hopefully earned from working. So therefore, in our minds and in our culture, our starting point is to work, is to earn, is to do, is to make. But they would hear this refrain and think, oh, that's right. I am made to rest. My starting point is rest. Anyone's mind done yet? Got more. What's interesting is we do this thing in the scriptures where they had to kind of go back and make sense of what was being said, and then we do these things where there's chapters and there's verse numbers and all this stuff. You can throw most of that out. It's not in the original text in which we read, okay? There's no chapter markers. But what's interesting is Genesis 1 plays out, and then you start with Genesis 2, and it seems completely separate. If you're online and you have to click to the next page to pick up on Genesis 2. But what's interesting, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, Genesis 1:1. That's how we start. Now, if we go to Genesis 2, the very beginning, and so the heavens and the earth were completed and all their heavenly lights. It's almost like all this stuff happened, and now you have a bookend. Heavens and the earth created, heavens and the earth created, and then that wasn't enough. So by the seventh day, God completed his work, which had been done. Skip down, then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because on it he rested from all his hard work, which he had created and made. And so what would be happening at this point is they're now having to think back, oh, that's right. It brings me back to Genesis 1:1. So it's actually kind of capturing the whole narrative here. Like, this is actually to stay together. And so when you get to this point, you're like, oh, yeah, that's right. I can go back. God created the heavens and the earth. Read through. How'd he do it? What happened? Why? Okay, cool. I can go back. And so it's actually to hold it together so that we would think about God creating over and over and over again. And when you see a bookend throughout the scriptures, this is everywhere, what you could start to ask, if there's bookends, then what's at the center? And there's a literary tool called a chiasm, and it helps us find the center of something. And sometimes it looks like this. I'll give an example here in a second. A, B, C, B, A. You could also go A, B, C, D, A, B, C, D. But what it's doing is it's bringing you to a center, and then it's almost saying it again on the way out a little bit differently. But it's still trying to draw the same point of how you arrived there. Here's a modern day quote from Martin Luther King Jr. I think it's that next slide. Yes. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So what we're drawing into is we need to consider the threat. What is the threat of this? And he got us there one way and then worked out another way to make sense of the whole meaning. This is a chiasm. We see this all throughout Scripture. When we go here again, you can look at it as verses or words. Let's go to the next slide. And what you can actually pick up is patterns. So if we look at Genesis 1:1 to Genesis 2, we actually see the whole creation narrative, and the time and the inhabitants are these themes. And it seems to be, as we work through and then back out, we start with time. God separates. That was him making time. You had days and you had nights. Time was, and space was created. It was then filled with inhabitants on days 2 and 3. And then you get to, we'll get there in a second, day 4, there's time and inhabitants together. Now it's the combining of these things, the full creation of this thing. And then that's right, we're going to still fill, and then we're going to get back to time. But we need to pick up the center to understand what time means and maybe the invitation in which we have here. So if we go to the next slide, when you find the middle, that word and what's happening with time and inhabitants, there's a word seasons. The original word there is moed. And seasons are the ways in which the Israelite people, the Hebrew people, made sense of their lives. There was festivals, there were sacrifices. It made sense of your day and your week. It made sense of when you prayed and when you gathered. It made sense of everything that happened on a calendar year. Their life was guided by seasons that were instructed by God who created them so that they could have life with Him. And if you do the word count in the original language, this word is found dead at the center of Genesis 1:1 to 2:1 to 3. Seasons. One of the translations we find here for seasons, the key translation, is Shabbat. We see the sun and moon, the day and night there in day 4, annual festivals, annual feast days, and sacrifice. Shabbat, we know it as Sabbath, and we understand Sabbath as rest. At the very center of God's creation account is rest. Do you feel rested in your life? You feel at peace? Do you feel wholeness beyond your circumstances? Are you a person of rest? Because this is at the center of God creating everything, including you. It's even at the center of His work, how He works, how He worked, how He created, how He creates. Rest is at the center. So I'm going to wrap us up here with a few thoughts. It's hard for you and I to imagine rest because we're not praised for rest. We're praised by working too hard, usually. How many have vacation days given to you and don't even use all of them throughout the year? Do you guys know there's a power button on your phone to turn it off? I bet a couple people couldn't even find it right now. I always have to remember to shut my phone. Wait, how do I do this again? You gotta press 2 buttons, and they've made it harder to shut your phone off. It used to just be a button on the outside. But if we step back in time, 2,500 years ago, ballpark, who was this being written to? Or we can do a little bit of back and forth here. Who were the people this was being written to? Cheat code, Israelites. Okay? Who were they? What could their life have looked like at that time? They just vacationed a lot? Okay, good. So they weren't taking vacations. They were in captivity. What would they have been doing? Hard work. Okay, manual labor. Doing what? Everything. Okay. Do we have a specific memory of a people coming out of a place? Bricks. For 4 centuries, this was a people who were doing manual labor in captivity, making bricks. From sunup to sundown, 7 days a week. They were told for 4 centuries that their worth was defined by how many bricks they could produce. This was a people who did not know rest. This was a people that worked to the bone. This was a people that if you've somehow caught in your senses that you want to press against the system and say, I will not work anymore, they'll say, all right, why don't we walk this way and we'll show you to your next life, essentially. So you couldn't, because then you wouldn't be able to protect your family anymore because you're not there anymore. This is a people who knew life only to work. And God is saying to them, rest. God is saying to them, it was good, it was good. And then you were made, and it was very good. This would have been a message that they would never have heard in their life, that who they are, their dignity, just the fact that they were alive, that they could have a sense of goodness, this was not their life. How countercultural this is. I mean, think back however far you can think of a grandparent. And that is what's passed down over and over and over again. That you are what you do. Your value is baked into what you can, and unfortunately, then what you can't do. You are worth nothing else than making a brick so that we can keep building more things. This is a people who do not know a God of love. This is a people who do not have an identity of someone being loved. These are people who are wandering, trying to find a way to make sense of their life and find some form of meaning beyond just putting together clay and water over and over and over and over and over again. And then God does this crazy thing in the end, here in verse 2, 1-3. And so the heavens and the earth were completed in all their heavenly lights. By the seventh day, God completed his work, which he had done. And he rested on the seventh day from all his work, which he had done. Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because on it he rested from all his work, which God had created and made. It repeats itself a little bit, doesn't it? That there is a day that is created for rest. That you don't have to keep working anymore. You can pause and you can simply be. Now notice, this one does not include the refrain. Not only it is good, but also, and then there was evening, and then there was morning. That one is left out. And what most would say, it's because God has invited everyone into a rest that hangs in the balance for the rest of their life. We don't actually need to find rest, and then we wake up the next day and we get going. He's saying that, can you trust that I have created you, that I've invited you into a life in which your only meaning is not by what you can do, but the fact that you've been created by me, you can find rest. For the shame and the guilt in which you carry, for what you have or have not done, you can find rest. For the pain and the ills of a body that is failing, you can find rest. For the injustices and the terrible things, you can find rest. When your insecurities are through the roof, you can actually find rest. When you don't know what to do with yourself because you don't feel like you can do much, you can find rest. I wish there was something more applicable to us right now in this moment today. You and I, those who are following the ways of Jesus, are actually people of rest, not productivity, not trying to perform, not trying to do more, not trying to please. Are you living from a place of rest? Do you believe that God has invited you into a life of rest? You don't have to just keep going. That there can be margin in your life. That there can be peace, that there can be rhythms, that you can live beyond yourself and for the sake of others. That you can find more mercy and compassion and joy in just simply creating God's creation with him, because he put the pen down. He dropped the brush. I've created it. And we know that it'll come in its fullness one day. And so what do we do from now? We rest. Because it seems that the people who've brought the most change in this world actually live from a place of rest. It was also Martin Luther King Jr. had said, I pray for an hour every day, and on the days in which it seems I can, I pray for 2. That is someone who changed the face of our earth in his radical love and nonviolence. And he did it from a place of rest. That does not make sense. You're supposed to go harder and fight more and yell more. Oh, from a place of rest, you actually get in touch with God in the way in which he created you, and you have a chance at being something that people can see Jesus in. We are invited into being a people of rest. Do you take your vacation days? Do you turn your phone off? Do you just say no to stuff every once in a while for the sake of it? I mean, this is like low shelf ideas. I could come up with more, but I think you could pick some of these up this week, today. You were created and God looked at you and said it was very good. can simply join him and trust the story that he is making all things new. Because isn't this the same moment at which Jesus entered the scene? This will ring a little bit differently now. Matthew 11, he says, "Come to me." Jesus says to a group of people, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart. You will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Is Jesus not just living out Genesis 1? Is he not still doing the work to invite you and I into a life of rest, of love, of shalom, of wholeness?